The first thing Anaya noticed when she woke up was the silence. No machines beeping. No voices murmuring nearby. Just the slow, rhythmic hum of her own breathing. She opened her eyes. The world swam into focus, white walls, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the soft creak of a chair shifting nearby. A nurse sat at the foot of her bed, her expression careful, expectant. "Welcome back," the woman said. Anaya tried to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. She swallowed, feeling the rawness there. "How long?" she rasped. The nurse's lips pressed into a thin line. 3 weeks. Anaya blinked. 3 weeks. She tried to sit up, but a sharp pain lanced through her skull, forcing her back against the pillows. Her hand instinctively lifted to her temple, fingers grazing a bandage wrapped tightly around her head. "What happened?" she whispered. The nurse hesitated. "You were found unconscious in an alleyway. No ID. No phone. Nothing. The police ran your fingerprints, no records." A strange chill curled through her chest. No records. No identity. Nothing. She closed her eyes. Inside her mind was a vast, empty space where her memories should have been. She tried reaching for something, anything. A face. A voice. All she found was darkness. She inhaled shakily. "Who am I?" The nurse hesitated, then reached for something on the bedside table, a small, worn-out cassette tape. The label was smudged, its ink faded. But she could still make out the words, scrawled in messy handwriting. "Sing to my songbird." She stared at it, her heartbeat stuttering. "Is this mine?" she asked. The nurse nodded. "It was found in your pocket." Anaya picked up the cassette with trembling fingers. Something about it felt familiar, like a song she had once known but had long since forgotten. A name. A melody. A life. Somewhere out there, the past existed. And she had to find it. The hospital released her a few days later. No family had come forward. No missing person reports matched her description. She walked out of the sterile white walls of the facility into a city that did not know her, just as she did not know herself. For the past week, she had waited, hoping that someone, anyone, would recognize her, claim her, tell her who she was. But the reality settled in her chest like a dull ache. She was a ghost, trapped in the body of a girl who should have been someone. The only thing tethering her to the past was the cassette tape in her pocket. The small, worn-out object felt heavier than it should, like it carried all the answers she needed but refused to give them. She needed answers. And answers, she realized, started with music. She spent the next few hours walking aimlessly, the city streets unfolding before her in an unfamiliar blur of honking taxis, flashing neon signs, and hurried pedestrians moving as if their lives depended on their next step. Then, she saw it. A small record shop tucked between two larger, flashier storefronts. Its faded neon sign flickered against the evening sky, half the letters burnt out, leaving it to read, Eco D Show instead of record shop. The inside smelled of dust and nostalgia. Vinyl records lined the shelves, album covers from forgotten decades stacked carelessly next to CDs and cassettes. The warm hum of a jazz record played in the background, crackling slightly as it spun on a vintage turntable. Anaya approached the counter. The shop owner, an old man with thick glasses and graying stubble, glanced up at her. His wrinkled hands rested on the wooden countertop, as if he had been waiting for someone to walk in. "I need to listen to this," she said, placing the cassette on the counter. The man raised a bushy eyebrow but said nothing. Without a word, he retrieved a cassette player from beneath the counter, dusted it off, and slid the tape into the slot. He pressed play. For a moment, only static filled the room. Then, her voice. Soft at first, then rising into something hauntingly beautiful. Anaya froze. She didn't recognize the song. But the voice. It was hers. Her breath hitched, her hands trembling as the melody filled the space between them. It was raw yet ethereal, a voice both fragile and powerful, stretching with emotion that sent a shiver through her spine. The old man listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't tap his fingers along to the rhythm, didn't nod in appreciation, he just stared at her, as if watching the song play was just as important as listening to it. When the tape clicked to a stop, he finally spoke. "You've got a gift, kid." His voice was rough but kind. A voice like that doesn't just disappear. Her throat tightened. But it had. And she didn't know how to get it back. That night, she wandered the city streets, her thoughts tangled in the echoes of her own voice. The cassette had confirmed it, she had been a singer. But that only led to more questions. Why had she disappeared? Why had no one come looking for her? And why did she feel like she wasn't supposed to remember? Her mind raced through the possibilities, each one darker than the last. Had she been running from something? Had she wanted to forget? Or worse, had someone wanted her to forget? The thought made her stomach churn. She turned a corner and froze. A boy stood beneath the glow of a street lamp, a guitar slung over his shoulder. His fingers danced over the strings, then his voice carried through the night air, raw and unpolished, yet filled with something she could only describe as truth. She wasn't the only one drawn in. A small crowd had gathered, some tossing coins into the open guitar case at his feet, others just standing still, silent, listening. Something about him held them in place, the way his voice cracked on the high notes, the way he sang as if each word carried the weight of a story he had never told. Then, mid-chorus, his eyes met hers. For a moment, the city faded. A flicker of recognition flashed across his face, but before she could process it, he strummed the final chord and let the music drift into silence. Then, he walked straight toward her. "You look lost," he said. His voice was lighter now, a contrast to the weight it had carried in song. Anaya hesitated. "I might be." He tilted his head slightly, studying her in a way that wasn't invasive but curious, careful. "You're not from around here." "I don't know where I'm from," she admitted. The words tasted strange. Saying them out loud made the reality settle in deeper. But he didn't react with pity. He simply nodded, his gaze drifting toward the cassette tape clutched in her hand. "What's that?" She hesitated, then held it up slightly. "A piece of me, I think." Something shifted in his expression. "Music usually brings people home," he said. "Even when they don't know where that is." Her fingers curled around the cassette. Maybe he was right. Maybe music wasn't just a clue to where she had been. Maybe it was the key to finding out who she was meant to be. The boy's name was Ren. He wasn't much older than she was, maybe 18, with a musician's soul and calloused fingertips from too many songs played on too many nights. His guitar case was battered, covered in faded stickers from places he had probably never been. He lived in a cramped apartment above a used bookstore, surviving off tips from street performances and late-night gigs in small venues that smelled of cheap beer and broken dreams. And for reasons Anaya didn't quite understand, he decided to help her. Maybe he saw something familiar in her lostness. Maybe he was just the kind of person who picked up stray things and tried to fix them. One afternoon, he handed her a guitar. "Sing something," he said. She stared at the instrument as if it were a puzzle she had no idea how to solve. Her fingers hovered over the strings, uncertain. "I don't know if I can," she admitted. Ren didn't push. He just waited. So she tried. At first, her voice was unsteady, unfamiliar, like a foreign language she had once spoken but had since forgotten. The words caught in her throat, the melody slipping away before she could hold on to it. She winced and set the guitar aside. "I sound awful." Ren shook his head. "You sound scared." She exhaled, looking away. "I am." Ren leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. Music isn't just about hitting the right notes. It's about feeling them. She met his gaze. "What if I don't remember how to feel them?" "You will," he said simply. "Just don't stop trying." And so, she didn't. Day by day, something shifted. At first, her voice wavered, like a candle flame in a breeze. But as Ren sat with her, strumming chords, humming harmonies, teaching her how to trust her own sound, something inside her began to wake up. The notes became clearer. The melodies stronger. And with each song, the missing pieces of herself felt a little closer. She still didn't remember who she had been. But when she sang, she felt less like a stranger to herself. Maybe, just maybe, music was her way back home. But the past had a way of catching up. One evening, as she flipped through old newspaper archives in the bookstore, her fingers idly tracing along the fragile edges of the pages, a headline froze her in place. Rising star Anaya Ellis mysteriously vanishes. Her breath caught. She stared at the name. It felt foreign and familiar all at once. Anaya Ellis. She swallowed hard, her heart hammering as she skimmed the article. There was a picture attached, her face staring back at her, eyes filled with a brightness she no longer recognized. The article detailed her sudden disappearance, how she had been on the verge of stardom before she had vanished without a trace. No explanation. No leads. Just gone. She read and reread the words, but they didn't offer any answers. Only more questions. She had been someone. Someone important. And yet, no one had come for her. No missing person reports. No desperate pleas on the news. It was as if someone had made sure that she stayed forgotten. She gripped the edges of the paper, her fingers trembling. Someone had erased her. And she needed to know why. The city's biggest underground music venue, The Hollow, was more than just a bar with a stage. It was a sanctuary for raw talent, a place where voices that didn't fit the industry mold found a home. Ren had taken her there before, letting her watch from the back of the dimly lit room. The walls were covered in banned stickers and graffiti, the chaotic history of every artist who had left their mark. The scent of cheap beer and old wood filled the air, and the floorboards creaked under the weight of too many hopefuls looking for a break. Every month, The Hollow hosted an open mic night. And this time, Ren signed them up. You need to be seen, he told her, tuning his guitar as they waited backstage. If you want to know who you are, then remind them. Anaya swallowed hard. What if I'm not ready? Ren smirked. Then we crash and burn in front of 100 strangers. No big deal. Easy for him to say. He hadn't spent the last few months terrified of his own voice. But even as the fear coiled in her stomach, something deeper pushed her forward. This was it. The moment she would prove to herself that she wasn't a ghost anymore. The host called their names, and the room filled with scattered applause as she and Ren stepped onto the small stage. The crowd barely looked up from their drinks, already caught in their own conversations. Indifferent. Anaya gripped the microphone, her palms sweating. Then Ren strummed the first chord. She closed her eyes, breathed in, and sang the first note. Everything stopped. The buzz of conversation faded into silence. Heads turned. Glasses were set down. A murmur rippled through the crowd, recognition. Her voice, once buried beneath fear and uncertainty, rose like a tide. And with every lyric, something clicked inside her. She didn't just sing. She remembered. The way her voice had once filled stadiums. The way the music had once felt like home. The way she had once been someone. A whisper swept through the crowd. Someone pulled out their phone, recording. And in the very back of the room, a man in a dark coat leaned against the wall. Watching her. His expression unreadable. But she knew. She had been found. The next morning, the internet was ablaze. Anaya Ellis is alive. Her name trended across social media. Articles flooded in, each one rehashing the same story. The missing starlet, the girl who had once been on the edge of fame, had returned. But Anaya didn't need the headlines to tell her what had happened. The past she had been searching for had come to find her instead. And with it, the truth. It came in waves, flashes of memories, snippets of conversations she had long forgotten. She hadn't just been a rising star. She had been exploited. Controlled. Owned. The people who had discovered her voice had never intended to let her go. They had shaped her into a product, stripped away her choices, made her their investment. And when she had finally tried to break free, she had disappeared. Her body had been found, but her name had been erased, and her voice silenced. Until now. Ren sat across from her in the cafe, scrolling through the countless articles on his phone. So, what happens now? Anaya wrapped her fingers around her coffee cup, exhaling slowly. Now, she had a choice. For the first time in years, her voice belonged to her. She wasn't just Anaya, the forgotten songbird. She was Anaya, the girl who chose to sing again. And this time, no one would silence her.